The first thing they noticed wasn't the cold, it was how the silence inside Pelican Bay felt like it had weight. Heavy enough to crush a man long before the walls ever did. Back then, few people outside the razor wire even knew what the security housing unit really was. Fewer still understood what it did to the men locked inside. But the ones who did, they spoke about it the same way survivors describe a place they barely escaped. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe, because this one only gets darker. The moment that pushed everything over the edge started with a routine walkthrough, the kind guards did a dozen times a day. In SHU terms, routine meant one thing: tension simmering beneath an artificial calm. The concrete was always cold. The air always smelled faintly of disinfectant and metal. And the cells, those windowless, sound-swallowing boxes, were designed less for punishment and more for erasing people. On that morning, a lieutenant found an inmate slumped on the floor. He wasn't unconscious. He wasn't injured. He was staring straight ahead, eyes wide open, lips trembling, but unable to speak. His hands shook as if they were responding to something the room itself was doing to him. A guard muttered, "Another one losing it." Another one. Like mental collapse was an expected stage in the SHU, the same way time wears down stone. The lieutenant ordered the inmate cuffed and taken to medical. The escort team moved in tightly, too tightly. The inmates knew the pattern. Once the door opened, the rules inside the cell didn't always match the rules written on paper. Shackles clattered. Boots landed harder than necessary. A camera hung from the lieutenant's chest, but it wasn't on. It almost never was. Later, someone in the medical unit whispered that the inmate had been diagnosed with severe psychosis long before he arrived in the SHU. He should never have been there. But at Pelican Bay in the early 90s, the line between discipline problem and mental health case blurred more with every new intake. Word spread quietly among the imprisoned population. They knew what this meant. If a man already breaking could still be locked in a concrete box for years, then nobody stood a chance. Meanwhile, a young lawyer named Susan, fresh out of law school, still clinging to the idea that justice worked the way the textbooks described, received an envelope from Pelican Bay. Inside was a letter written in shaky handwriting, describing the same man the lieutenant had found on the floor. The letter wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. It was scared. It ended with one line: "Someone needs to see what's happening here." That letter landed on her desk the same week she heard rumors of another medical emergency in the SHU. Someone pulled out after a violent extraction, face bruised, ribs possibly broken. Official reports blamed noncompliance. Witness accounts told a different story. Susan had no idea yet that these fragments, one inmate's breakdown, one extraction gone wrong, one quiet letter, were pieces of something much bigger. Something the state had tried for years to keep buried under policy manuals and sealed doors. But when she drove toward Crescent City for the first time, staring at the forest swallowing the highway, she felt it. The sense that something inside that prison wasn't just broken. It was designed to stay hidden. And as she stepped through the gates of Pelican Bay, the sound of the electric locks closing behind her made one thing clear: whatever was happening in the SHU, she wasn't supposed to see it. The deeper Susan walked into Pelican Bay, the more it felt like the prison was studying her. Corridors were too long, too quiet. Guards spoke in clipped, practiced tones, as if they had all rehearsed the same script. And every door that buzzed open revealed another piece of a system designed to keep certain truths sealed away. She started with interviews, short, controlled conversations with men in the SHU. Every inmate she met showed the same signs: slow blinking, stiff posture, voices flattened from years of speaking into silence. They didn't look beaten. They looked hollowed out. As if the loneliness itself had carved them from the inside. One man told her he hadn't touched another human being in 6 years. Another couldn't remember the sound of his own mother's voice. A third asked her if the sun still felt warm on skin, because he wasn't sure his memory of it was real. But the most unsettling thing wasn't what they said, it was what they didn't. Every time she asked about use of force, or cell extractions, or medical care, the conversation shifted. Eyes darted to the side. Knees bounced under the restraints. Voices dropped into whispers that barely carried across the table. Something was happening in those hallways, something they didn't feel safe describing. Not even to a lawyer. Then came the sealed reports. Through discovery, Susan received documents detailing staff behavior inside the SHU. Many were routine logs, counts, meals, escort notes. But here and there she found anomalies, lines blacked out without explanation, timestamps that didn't match witness statements, medical reports missing entire pages. And tucked between them were memos written by officers who had tried to speak up, only to be sidelined, reassigned, or pressured into silence. One memo described an inmate with schizophrenia being left in isolation for months without evaluation. Another warned that certain extraction teams routinely exceeded policy, a polite way of saying the force used wasn't remotely necessary. Every document hinted at something larger, but nothing spelled it out. It was like looking at a puzzle designed to hide its own picture. Meanwhile, the prison administration pushed back harder. Requests for tours were denied. Interviews were cut short. One afternoon, a sergeant followed her through the corridor with a stare that felt more like a warning than security. "You don't understand what these men are capable of," he said. "You don't know what you're stepping into." But the more they tried to shut her out, the more determined she became. And then, by chance, or maybe luck, she met Dr. Leland, a soft-spoken psychologist who had worked in the SHU longer than he wanted to admit. He looked exhausted, like every year in that place had carved a line across his face. He spoke carefully at first. But eventually, he told her what nobody else would. "I've watched men unravel in those cells," he said. "Not because they're violent. Not because they're dangerous. Because the conditions themselves are designed to break them. Some of them were sick long before they got here. And instead of treatment, they were locked in the deepest hole we had." He paused, lowering his voice even further. "And the worst part? Some people here knew exactly what isolation does to the mind. They knew, and they sent them anyway." Those words changed everything. If mentally ill prisoners were being funneled into the SHU intentionally, then the issue wasn't negligence, it was a systemic choice. As she drove away from Pelican Bay that evening, the northern sky turning dark above the redwoods, she felt the weight of it settle across her shoulders. This wasn't about one inmate collapsing on a cell floor. This was about an entire structure built to keep the suffering out of sight. But the turning point came days later, when a clerk from the Attorney General's office accidentally included a document that hadn't been meant for her eyes. A document that tied everything together. A document that revealed exactly who inside Pelican Bay had known, and how long they had kept it hidden. And with that discovery, Susan realized she was up against far more than a prison. She was up against a machine. The document landed on Susan's desk like a live wire. It wasn't dramatic. No bold headline. No confession. Just a routine administrative form, except for one section buried deep inside. A line stating that certain prisoners with diagnosed mental illnesses could be managed within SHU units at staff discretion, even when evaluations recommended therapeutic housing instead. It wasn't an accident. It was protocol. The language was clinical, but the implication was unmistakable. Someone inside Pelican Bay had made a deliberate choice: move the most vulnerable prisoners into the most punishing environment on the property, then bury the paper trail under layers of bureaucratic phrasing. With that single line, the whole case shifted. Now she wasn't just proving suffering. She was proving intention. When Madrid versus Gomez finally went to court, the courtroom felt like a pressure chamber. Former inmates testified through trembling voices. Medical experts explained what isolation does to the human mind. Officials defended their decisions with rigid certainty. And for the first time, the SHU, this hidden world behind concrete and control, was forced into the light. One psychologist described the SHU as social death. Another called it a place where the brain has nowhere to go. Terms the public had never heard were suddenly part of the national conversation: sensory deprivation, decompensation, hypervigilance. The judge listened to every word. But the most powerful moment came when Dr. Leland took the stand. He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't turn emotional. He simply described what he had seen, the unraveling, the confusion, the quiet suffering that didn't always leave visible marks. And then he said, "No one can survive that kind of isolation without consequences. Not even the strongest among them." Those words hung in the air like a verdict of their own. When Judge Felton Henderson delivered his ruling in 1995, the courtroom fell silent. He acknowledged the dangers of managing violent individuals. He recognized the challenges of operating a high-security prison. But he drew a line, one that California could no longer ignore. The SHU, he said, wasn't just harsh. For prisoners with serious mental illnesses, it was unconstitutional. The ruling didn't dismantle Pelican Bay. It didn't empty the SHU. But it forced the state to confront the harm it had buried under paperwork and policy. Mental health screening had to improve. Excessive force had to be monitored. The most psychologically fragile inmates could no longer be left to deteriorate behind steel doors. And most importantly, Madrid versus Gomez cracked open a door that had been sealed for decades, exposing the reality of long-term isolation to the rest of the country. Years later, that crack would widen into a movement, one that ultimately ended indefinite solitary confinement in California. Pelican Bay didn't change overnight. No prison does. But the silence that once protected its darkest corners was broken. People were watching now. People were asking questions. And the men who had written those letters, the ones who felt forgotten, finally knew someone had listened. The ruling didn't make them whole. It didn't erase the years they'd lost. But it gave them something most had stopped expecting: acknowledgement. Proof that what happened in those concrete boxes wasn't invisible after all. As Susan packed her files at the end of the case, she understood something she hadn't grasped when that first trembling letter reached her desk. This fight wasn't about exposing every secret. It was about dragging at least one truth into daylight, no matter how tightly the system tried to hold it down. And for the men locked in the SHU, that truth mattered. It meant the walls couldn't stay silent forever. If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.